Can a driver completely change the destiny of a team with just 1 week of testing? What did Ferrari and the FIA engineers see that left Leclerc completely shocked? When Ferrari officially announced the arrival of Lewis Hamilton for the 2026 season, many considered it a media maneuver, a coup d'état that was more symbolic than functional. In the eyes of many experts, uniting the 7-time world champion with a team that had been without a clear direction for years seemed like a risky experiment. But what happened in Barcelona, during the private tests in January, broke all preconceived expectations and set off a silent alarm in the rest of the grid. It was not a progressive adaptation or a usual learning curve. It was a devastating entry, worthy of a pilot who still has unfinished business with history. From the first day of testing at the Circuit de Catalunya, Hamilton made it clear that he had not arrived in Maranello to fulfill a ceremonial role. As soon as he got out of the car after his first laps, the data already spoke for itself. Internal comparisons showed a difference of approximately half a second per lap between him and Charles Leclerc. A figure that, in any Formula One context, is alarming. But when this difference occurs between teammates in a controlled environment with the same car specification, in similar tire and fuel conditions, it becomes an existential threat to the internal balance of the team. In the paddock, this difference in pace began to be talked about as if it were an open secret. In technical forums, engineers and analysts debated whether it was a matter of driving styles, differences in preparation, or worse still, a natural adaptation of Hamilton to the car that not even Ferrari's own technicians had anticipated. Leclerc, who until now had been the central figure of the Scuderia's sporting project, suddenly found himself surpassed by someone who had been around for less than a week. The commotion soon spread to the internal corridors of Maranello. The engineering department, led by Loic Serra, began to review in detail the telemetry of both pilots to find technical explanations that justified such a difference. But what they found was even more disconcerting. Hamilton was not only faster, but more efficient in every phase of the lap. In braking, in traction, in corner entry, in energy recovery. It was not a marginal advantage, it was a systematic superiority. This reality began to generate latent tension. Leclerc, accustomed to being the absolute leader of the team, now had to process a new hierarchy that had not been agreed upon in offices, but had been imposed on the track. Comparisons were inevitable. Internally, Ferrari began to consider that many of the difficulties it had experienced in past seasons might not be completely linked to the car, but rather to the way its drivers pushed it to the limit. But there is something deeper that makes this moment a turning point. Hamilton's body language during those days was eloquent. There were no gestures of doubt, no visible periods of adaptation. He walked in the box like someone who had been there for years. He spoke to the engineers as if he had been born into Italian technical culture. His feedback was clear, direct, without embellishment. And more importantly, their suggestions were immediately beginning to be reflected in the car's performance. Outside the Ferrari environment, the impression was just as strong. Engineers from rival teams began asking for access to onboard recordings of Hamilton's laps to understand what he was doing differently. In a sport where improvements usually come by millimeters or thousandths, seeing such a strong eruption from day one is little less than an earthquake. And in Maranello, what began as a risky bet on a legend from the past has begun to transform into a new narrative. Ferrari's competitive renaissance now passes, inevitably, through the hands of Lewis Hamilton. What no one in the structure expected was that this rebirth would be accompanied by such a rapid displacement of its most beloved and promising figure, Charles Leclerc. Because in Formula One, when two drivers share a team, it doesn't matter who arrived first, nor who represents the future. It only matters who is faster. And in January 2026 in Barcelona, Hamilton was faster. Clearly faster. And that, for a team like Ferrari, changes everything. In Formula One, words can be misleading, narratives manipulative, and appearances confusing. But there is one element that never lies: data. And when the FIA decided, unexpectedly, to publish fragments of the SF-26 telemetry after private testing in Barcelona, the truth was exposed with brutal clarity. What the Times already suggested disturbingly, that average difference of half a second between Hamilton and Leclerc, was confirmed with technical evidence that does not allow interpretation. Hamilton's fastest lap, a 1 minute and 16.348 seconds run on soft tires, became the subject of obsessive analysis in simulators and engineering centers across the paddock. At first glance, it was a remarkable time, but not unprecedented. What made the difference was context. That time was not the product of a glorified low-fuel lap or aggressive engine maps. Nor was it achieved under exceptionally favorable track conditions or with the help of slipstreams. It was a clean lap, executed in a long stint, with a medium fuel load and with the hybrid system configured in a conservative mode. In other words, it was a warning. Beyond the hybrid systems, what drew powerful attention was the traceability of the car's behavior lap after lap. Hamilton's fastest lap was not a mirage. It was part of a sequence where several previous and subsequent laps barely varied by a few tenths. Repeatability is a key factor in performance engineering, and what the records revealed was that Hamilton was not only fast, but could be fast with absolute consistency. There was no miraculous return. There was a progressive dominance, a systematic appropriation of the car lap after lap. Leclerc, on the other hand, had a better time of 1 minute and 16.6 seconds. More than 2 tenths behind in similar conditions. And although that, in isolation, might seem like a reasonable difference in the preseason, the technical detail made it more worrying. Its graphs showed micro-corrections in cornering, fluctuations in energy delivery, and areas where the car seemed not to respond linearly to its inputs. Nothing dramatic, but indicative of a struggle to understand the car that Hamilton didn't seem to be having. The fact that most bothered rival engineers was that Hamilton achieved this level of performance without having requested a single suspension modification during the entire test. This is almost unheard of. Generally, pilots work dozens of laps just to fine-tune rebound, height, or longitudinal rebound. Hamilton, on the other hand, adapted to the base configuration of the SF-26 and still found the limit, exploited it, and repeated it. Therefore, when it is said that data changed everything, it is not hyperbole. It's a reality. Because in the cold analysis of the telemetry, it was clear that Ferrari with Hamilton had found an unexpected formula. A balanced car, a tuned power unit, and a driver who did not need months to understand it. He understood it in days. And that level of understanding so early, in a sport where adaptation makes the difference between winning or disappearing, represents an advantage that can tilt the entire championship before it begins. In parallel, Fred Vasseur, team director, assumed a more political than technical role. He understood that he had to preserve balance within the team without stopping the natural momentum that Hamilton brought with him. His speech to the media was eloquent. Having 2 drivers of this level is a luxury. Each one brings a different perspective. Our job is to find the point where both converge and enhance each other. But that convergence, at least for now, was not happening. Ferrari was seeing a new leadership figure emerge, and that figure was not Leclerc. Furthermore, the impact of this internal dynamic began to be felt outside the team. In the paddock, comparisons multiplied. Engineers from other teams, analysts and journalists were already talking about a changing of the guard at Ferrari. Some even began to question whether Leclerc would be able to sustain his position if the performance trend remained in Hamilton's favor during the first Grand Prix of the season. The most significant element, however, is not visible to the naked eye. It is the perception of control. In previous years, Ferrari had been a team where strategic errors, on-track arguments, and a lack of technical leadership had eroded trust. With Hamilton, at least in these first weeks, that narrative began to break down. There was order, clarity, method. And that type of structure tends to generate internal loyalties very quickly. Therefore, beyond the times and statistics, the real earthquake in Ferrari is occurring in the human dimension of the team. In the silent reconfiguration of leadership. In the weight that Hamilton's voice now has in technical meetings. In the glances that were previously directed at Leclerc and that now look, almost unconsciously, for the driver who has brought with him not only speed, but a new way of thinking. A way that Ferrari had been looking for years without really knowing how to find it. And now, finally, it seems to have arrived. F1 lives on iconic moments, unexpected turns, and intense rivalries. And if what we saw in Barcelona is sustained throughout the season, we are facing one of those times that are remembered for generations. Not because it is the most spectacular in each race, but because it represents a paradigm shift. A restructuring of the natural order of the grid. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.